Scripture.
This morning we are continuing a series on the aspects of the vow of membership in the United Methodist Church: prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. And it's no accident that those are the aspects of a United Methodist Church's vows. When you read the writings of John Wesley, you find that Wesley outlined means of grace. How do we experience God's grace in our lives? That grace that comes before we're even aware of it. Prevenient grace, he called it. That grace of God that is working in our lives when we're completely unaware. We have no idea about God. We have no interest in God, but God is at work in our lives. And justifying grace, where we are justified, we're made righteous, where we have a new start, a new beginning, a new relationship with God and with others. And sanctifying grace, that is God's work in our lives to enable us to follow faithfully as Jesus calls us to follow. God's work in our lives to make us more and more who God intends for us to be. So how do we experience that grace in our lives? And John Wesley said, well, there are a number of means of grace, and he categorized them in two ways. There are the works of piety, and that's worship and Bible study and gathering in community, holy conferencing, he called it, and prayer. Those are the sorts of things that are works of piety, and part of our membership vow covers that: prayers, presence. But they're also the works of mercy. And when you read this parable of Jesus, you find that those works of mercy, nearly all of them, are spelled out in this parable 4 times. In 10 verses, Jesus says 4 times what is most important. 4 times in just 10 verses. That means we ought to pay attention to that. That what our life is judged by, what's most significant in our life, are these works of mercy. Did we feed the hungry? Did we give water to the thirsty? Did we welcome the stranger? Did we clothe the naked? Did we take care of the sick and visit those who are in prison? The parable ends with, when you've done it to the least of these members of my family, my brothers and sisters, you have done it to me. Today we're talking about the part of the vow that is service. What difference does it make when we serve? And I want to say it makes all the difference in the world. It is a means of grace. It is a way in which we experience the grace of God, and we make present the grace of God in the lives of people where that grace would otherwise seem to be completely absent. So it makes all the difference in the world. Now, there are obstacles to practicing this means of grace, these means of grace, under the heading of service. There's fear. Often we're afraid. We're afraid of rejection, afraid that it won't go well, afraid of being ineffective, afraid of the other who is different from ourselves. There's fear. And over again, the message of the Bible is, don't be afraid, fear not. We hear over and over again. Perfect love casts out fear, the Bible says. Paul said to young Timothy, God has given us not a spirit of fear and cowardice, but a spirit of love and power and self-discipline. So we have that obstacle to overcome, our fear. Another one is greed. It's really related to fear. When we are greedy, generally we're afraid there's not enough to go around. And so we hoard for ourselves. Greed is also akin to idolatry. We can set up at the central place in our lives stuff: money, possessions, influence, power, all of that stuff that we possess. It can become our God. So that's certainly an obstacle. Terrible theology, misplaced, misguided theology is another obstacle as well. Sometimes people will say, that person is in that condition, that person is poor, whatever the condition is, because he or she deserves it. They're being punished somehow. That's terrible theology. Sometimes we even say, well, God will take care of it. Well, that's terrible theology too, if by that we mean that we don't have to do anything, that's God's business and God will take care of it. No, as a matter of fact, God takes care of it with us, with our hands and our passion and our heartbeat and our knowledge and our skills and all the gifts that God has given to us. That's the way God takes care of it. A fascinating letter that John Wesley, letter and the response that John Wesley wrote to a man named Tom in his community illustrates this. Tom was destitute. Tom had fallen on very hard times, and Wesley wrote the letter and reminded him of Psalm 137, where it says, "Trust the Lord, and God will feed you. You will be fed." But he included in that letter not just the words of encouragement, but a significant sum of money for Tom. Tom's response to John Wesley's letter was, of course, a heartfelt thank you. But he also said in that response, "I have always appreciated the beauty of Psalm 137. Now I understand the way in which God feeds people." It's our hands. It's our abilities. It's our passion. And misplaced theology says, no, God will take care of that. And then, of course, there's apathy. That's another obstacle. Apathy. The early church fathers listed it as one of the 7 deadly sins, to come to the place where you don't care. They called it sloth. Sloth sounds kind of like laziness or something like that, but it's a much more profound word. It means I don't care. It's apathy. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Screwtape Letters, deals with the subject of apathy. If you know the book, you know that Screwtape is a senior demon, a tempter, and he is writing words of advice to his nephew Wormwood, who is an apprentice tempter demon. And he's giving words of advice about how to tempt his client, and he says, above all, keep him comfortable. If he begins to think too deeply about what's going on around him, remind him that he wants to plan what he's going to have for lunch. And if he's troubled by what he sees around him, just remind him not to think about that. That causes indigestion. And then Screwtape says to his nephew, "I will always make sure there is a supply of bad people. Your job, Wormwood, is to make sure there are always people who don't care." Apathy. It's deadly for us. And yet what I want us to hear this morning is the power of that vow and seeing it through. That I will serve. I will serve with all that I am and all that I have. The power of service. Because the reality is we are all connected. What happens to my neighbor happens to me. And what happens to me happens to my neighbor also. I love the story of the corn farmer who won all these awards, and someone asked him the secret, and he said, "Well, there's really no secret. I just give my best seed corn to my neighbors." And he said, "Really? Seriously? They're your competitors too. Why would you give them your best seed?" And he said, "You don't understand the way pollination works. The wind blows where it wills, and the pollen goes from field to field and farmer to farmer. And if my neighbor's corn is inferior, then over time my corn will become lessened in quality as well. The best way to grow good corn is to make sure my neighbor grows good corn." That's really a parable for the power of service. It's a parable for the way we are to live in community with each other. But it takes courage, and it takes being able to risk to do that, because we have all these obstacles to overcome. And so it requires of us this ability to risk, to give ourselves to something that is really, really important. These past few weeks we've heard a lot about Steve Jobs and stories about his life. The founder of Apple Computer, a real genius. He transformed the way we communicate, the way we relate to one another, the way we get things done. A remarkable person. One of those stories is the story of John Sculley. John Sculley was the CEO of PepsiCo. And early on, Steve Jobs looked around to see who will take Apple Computer to new heights and make it a great company. And he kept coming back to John Sculley. John Sculley, in midlife, had it made. Great salary, very comfortable, great standing in the community. And he could not imagine why he would leave PepsiCo to go into this risky venture in California. Here's what convinced him. Steve Jobs one day looked him in the eye and said, "Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water? Or do you want to change the world?" Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want to change the world? That's a challenging question, isn't it? It's a challenging question for us. Do you want to just go about business not paying much attention or not thinking much about the course of your life, or do you want to change the world? Or for our church, do we want to drift along, or do we want to change the world? And the way we change the world are these means of grace, and one of those is service, where we literally bring God's grace to a situation as instruments of God's work, and in that we experience the grace of God ourselves. A quick story of the difference this can make. A young woman named, 10-year-old child named Annie had been abandoned by her father. Her mother died. Her aunt and uncle did not want her because she suffered from a condition that rendered her virtually blind. And because of that and all the frustrations in her life, she was a very difficult child. And she had temper tantrums. She screamed. She threw things. She was really out of control, and no one wanted her. So she was placed in a home, the Tewksbury Alms Home in Massachusetts. This was 1876. There was another child in that home, older, who decided that as a Christian it was her duty to serve Annie. Her name was Maggie. And Maggie was committed no matter what Annie did, no matter how much she cursed or threw food or thrashed around or refused to take a bath, that Maggie would care for her, and she did. And over time, Annie began to soften. She began to see that she's not the only one hurting, but Maggie has also been abandoned. And she begins to learn. She begins to grow, and she begins to change, and decides that she wants to go to a school for the blind. And she does. And meanwhile, they have perfected some operations that were able to restore part of her eyesight. And at the end of her schooling, she told the authorities in the school that she wanted to find someone who was blind and had behavior problems to go and to help them. They found a 7-year-old girl in Alabama, and she went, Annie Sullivan, to work with Helen Keller. Now think of that. A girl named Maggie ultimately influenced and touched the lives of hundreds and thousands of people because she served one person who then served one person who then transformed many people's lives. Helen Keller. It's the power of service. It's that to which you and I are called. It is a means of God's grace. I want to close with the words of Mother Teresa. As we think about Mother Teresa's words, I want to remind you of something that happened maybe a year ago. I'm not quite sure, a year and a half ago. Reverend Larry Grubb had been on sabbatical. Some of you will remember this. And while he was on sabbatical, Larry grew a beard that was down past his chest. Larry had also stopped wearing his toupee that he used to wear. Not too long before he went on sabbatical, he gave it up altogether. He was never very self-conscious about it. Sometimes he'd show up with it and sometimes not. But he came back. When he was coming back, he called me and he said, "I want to know, do you think I ought to shave my beard?" Because he had sent pictures of himself. I said, "No, I tell you what, why don't you disguise yourself? Wear some old ragged clothes and put on some sunglasses and a cap and come to church, see how you're received." And he did. And I'd kind of forgotten that was the Sunday he was coming back, and when I first saw him, I didn't recognize him. And I was expecting it. He sat right over there, and at the end of the service, he made his way down to the front, and you could feel the tension in the room. I could see it in everyone's face as he came, and especially when he took the microphone. See, I didn't tell my family about this, and they were really worried about that. What's he going to say? And he revealed who he was. You know, you look at him and you know Larry Grubb. You know that you would do anything for Larry. You'd do anything in the world for Larry. You'd welcome him. You'd care for him. If he was hungry, you'd feed him. If he was thirsty, you'd give him water to drink. But he didn't look like Larry. And his reception was mixed. Some people did the best they could to welcome him. Some sort of stepped a little distance away because we're not sure if he's safe. The thing is, when we have that person standing in front of us, that doesn't look like Jesus. That looks nothing like Solomon's head of Christ. All those paintings we've seen. We'd do anything in the world for Jesus. The fact is, it's Jesus. As Mother Teresa put it, in distressing disguise. So here are her words that she wrote in 1983 from the hospital when she was hospitalized. It was a meditation on our gospel text for today. Jesus is the hungry to be fed. Jesus is the thirsty to be satiated. Jesus is the naked to be clothed. Jesus is the homeless to be taken in. Jesus is the sick to be healed. Jesus is the lonely to be loved. Jesus is the unwanted to be wanted. Jesus is the leper to wash his wounds. Jesus is the beggar to give him a smile. Jesus is the drunkard to listen to him. Jesus is the mental to protect him. Jesus is the little one to embrace him. Jesus is the blind to lead him. Jesus is the dumb to speak for him. Jesus is the crippled to walk with him. Jesus is the drug addict to befriend him. Jesus is the prostitute to remove from danger and befriend her. Jesus is the prisoner to be visited. Jesus is the old to be served. Amen.